Welcome to session 4. In this session, we're going to be talking about the story that is connected with the Torah. Those would be the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And I know we've been talking about Genesis a little bit, but we will feature in our conversation today basically the story of Moses, but I want you to be able just to put this story into its framework of the Torah itself. You'll recall that in the book of Genesis, Genesis 12, God calls Abraham, and he's going to move him to a place where there will be a new land, and God gives promises to him that he will have land and descendants, and he will be a blessing to the world, or his family will. And then, of course, as the storyline of Genesis goes on, Abraham and Sarah have a son, Isaac, and then there are risks that go with that, with the promise of Abraham being fulfilled. And then there's Jacob and Joseph. Well, by the time you get to the end of Genesis, in the Joseph story, Joseph has ended up himself in Egypt. His brothers come down because of a famine, and the family has to kind of start all over again in Egypt, of all places. Well, that seems a very long way from the original promise that was given to Abraham. And it seems like the story just from Abraham, from Genesis 12 to the end of the book of Genesis, has moved well beyond what conceivably were God's original intentions. And so when the story of Genesis ends, we have a people who are in Egypt. As the book of Exodus opens, we learn that this people have grown, and they have been there for 430 years. Hard to imagine how much time and distance has gone by in those years, and try to imagine how far it must seem, how long ago it was that there was Father Abraham, and all of those promises that were made to him, I would imagine, seem to just have been tossed in the wind a long time ago. So we're going to kind of just focus on the continuation of the story from Exodus to Deuteronomy, and then we're going to just, after we kind of take a look at the basic storyline itself, we're going to talk a little bit about reading that story, not only in terms of its theological significance, but in this particular session, we're going to be talking about reading the story for its geographical meaning. In other words, how do various places play a very significant part in this ongoing drama of God of redemption. And so we'll visit some of those places, and then as we become aware of them, as you read the rest of God's story throughout the Bible, you will be able to make connections to many of the kinds of places that we will encounter along the way, Exodus through the end of Deuteronomy. So here we are in Exodus. The people have been in Egyptian slavery. God raises up Moses to be the deliverer of those people. And you know the story of Moses from birth, his mother having to put him in a basket. Pharaoh's daughter, of all people, finds him. So Moses is raised in the privilege of Egyptian luxury, and as time goes on, begins to realize that the people who are in fact enslaved by the Egyptians are his people. He attempts to make some redemptive move in that, but ultimately things just unravel, fall apart. And at the end of the day, he has to escape both the Egyptians and the Hebrew children. The only place he can go is to the desert. And often when we think of the desert, we think certainly a place where God is not present, but of all things, it is in the desert that Moses has this revelation from God, this experience, this encounter with God through a burning bush. And it is in this experience that God reveals his name. He reveals what he wants Moses to do. He knows Moses by name. He is Yahweh. And in a place where undoubtedly Moses would have never anticipated experiencing God, here he is in a living conversation with him. And God tells Moses that he wants Moses to go back down to Egypt to confront Pharaoh and to be the leader of his people, of God's people, as they come out of Egypt. Well, imagine the task of doing that, all from a burning bush. So Moses goes down, and as the story unfolds, Moses confronts Pharaoh, and after a number of plagues, ultimately leading to the children of, or the Hebrew children crossing through the Red Sea into the wilderness, where once they are there, several months into that, Moses again experiences God, this time on a mountain. And it's in that experience that God reveals what we typically call the Ten Commandments, and we'll visit that in just a moment. And God is beginning to form a people, form his people, out of the slave people that were just originally in Egypt. Then the story, the narrative kind of comes to something of a pause as we come out of the book of Exodus and into the book of Leviticus. The book of Leviticus focuses on the presence of God among his people. What does that look like? And so it is in the book of Leviticus where we encounter things like particular sacrifices and feast days and functions of the priest. All of that is ultimately about here is a God that has rescued a people. Moses has led them. God has spoken through Moses to the people at Mount Sinai. And now there is this incredible book about the nature of the relationship between God and the people in terms of worship. So the book of Leviticus, although the narrative pauses for just a bit, the book of Leviticus, just a grand book of worship and the expression of worship in the presence of God. In the book of Numbers, the narrative picks back up, continues, and it continues really at something of a faster pace than we experienced it in Exodus. The people, when they came out of Egypt, made their way ultimately to Mount Sinai. All of that was about a 14-month story. The book of Numbers, a number of years are passing by, and as you are aware, an entire generation, the original generation of the Hebrew children who were rescued, are going to die off because of their disobedience, and a second generation is going to be raised. So the book of Numbers recounts a number of very different stories of what happens to the Hebrew children in the wilderness, and much of that has to do with their disobedience and their rebellion to God. By the time we get to the book of Deuteronomy, Moses, who is still alive, along with Caleb and Joshua from the original generation, Moses is speaking to second generation. He is speaking to the people who will go into the promised land. He is reminding them and helping them remember the stories of God in the past. He is encouraging them to move forward with the story. And at the very end is a very moving and powerful account, at the very last chapter of Deuteronomy, of God taking Moses, and now that his Moses' calling is complete, God takes him, and in his death he buries him in a place that no one knows about. So you can kind of get something of a vision of the movement of the story and get the sense of the story from Abraham all the way through Moses. Now let's take that story, and for our purposes in this session, we're going to talk a little bit about not only the theology of the story itself, which is very significant, but in several places, how the landscape plays into the theology, how it plays into the story, and how it becomes not just features like rivers or hills or wilderness or a mountain that are just part of a geographical landscape. In a sense, they become theological landscape. They help tell the story. And as you read through the Bible, and you encounter these places throughout the Bible, many times you'll actually be able to see the theological significance of these kinds of places, rivers, mountains, wilderness, be able to see their connection back to the stories of Exodus and through Deuteronomy, and you'll be able to more fully understand how God's redemptive story is playing out and how it is impacting us and what our role is in carrying forth that mission. So here we are with a people who have been in Egypt. And as you could easily imagine, right from the beginning of this story with a people in Egypt, we have a theological place, not just a place, Egypt, but Egypt becomes a place that has theological meaning and significance. It's a place of captivity and a place of oppression. And as you see that notion played out throughout Scripture, you will know that it roots in this story of where people have been for over 400 years in captivity. And now God is going to provide someone to redeem them, to rescue them, to bring them out. So the story begins, and Moses is there, and when Moses goes to meet Pharaoh, it is actually a confrontation. On the surface, it looks like this is a confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh, but this is a place where you have an opportunity to think theologically about this story. It is not just a confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh. It is actually a confrontation that is something of a contest between the God of Moses, Yahweh, the very God that Moses met at the burning bush, and the many gods of Pharaoh or the Egyptians. The outcome of all of this is that the God of Moses, Yahweh, is able to defeat handedly every god of Pharaoh through 10 plagues. So, in this contest, in this confrontation, it's as if Moses says, I have Yahweh, and that's all I have, all I need. And Pharaoh says, well, I have all of these gods. And systematically, one by one, Yahweh defeats the gods of the Egyptians. As Pharaoh finally concedes to letting the people go, Moses gathers the people, and they make preparations for their pilgrimage. As they begin, amazingly enough, they bump right into the Red Sea, And it looks like the story is going to just come to a very cruel end as Pharaoh changes his mind and as the Egyptian charioteers and army are going to be pursuing the children of Israel. So it really looks like a death trap for the Hebrew children. God does this incredible work, and the sea is opened, and all of the Hebrew children go through. As the Egyptians get in, the waters cover them. So what was initially appearing to be the end of the story, before it even had a chance to begin, before God could even take the people and get them out to a place where he would reveal to them and form out of them a nation, it really looked like it was going to be washed away or defeated right there at the Red Sea. Well, in fact, what happens is Egypt's army is defeated at the Red Sea. And this event of the Exodus is, in fact, the most significant redemptive picture and event of the entire Old Testament. It is the event that more so than any other event in the Old Testament story reveals what redemption, what rescue is all about, what salvation is all about. It is the event that is only eclipsed in significance by the story of Jesus himself and his death and resurrection, and Jesus' own exodus through the grave and hell. So the story of the Exodus is not just a grand story, it becomes a theological story, and a great measure of the significance of the theology itself rests in the fact that there was a great body of water, and there was, prior to that, the land of Egypt, and then there was the barrier of the water, which became a means, in a sense, through which God's people were delivered and saved, but they are delivered into a wilderness. So we're back again to kind of where Moses started, a place that would be more commonly thought of. There's not a God in a wilderness, or would God would live in the wilderness. And nevertheless, God demonstrates that he is with this people. And by day they have a cloud, by night they have a fire. They ultimately, after several months, make their way to Mount Sinai. And God calls Moses to go up to a mountain, and the people can see the thunder, or hear the thunder and the lightning, and can feel the trembling of the earth under their feet. This incredible encounter or experience that is happening between Yahweh and Moses. And it's in that encounter in which we typically call the Ten Commandments that God reveals to Moses. The truth is, they are really the 10 words of God. Commandments, the word itself kind of has the notion of legalism or things not to do. But when you think about this in the terms in which it really was given and intended, these were 10 words of God. These are words that basically frame the nature of the relationship of the people and God. They are words that reveal the nature and character of the kind of God that has led them into the wilderness. They are words that reveal how a people of God are to relate to God, how they are to relate to each other, and ultimately how they are to relate to the rest of the world in terms of blessing. So rather than being a document that is binding, it is a revelatory word from God that brings freedom. The people are now free to be God's people. They are free to relate to Yahweh. They are free to relate to each other in terms of covenant and what a body of people, what a group of people who are related to God act like, and what they look like, and a people who are on mission. And so actually what happens at Mount Sinai is an incredible moment of freedom as the terms of covenant, as the terms of relationship are revealed. But they are not without certainly consequence, and just as the earlier promises to Abraham at times seem to have been scattered to the winds, Moses no more gets down the mountain than the people are breaking the very terms of covenant and relationship that were established, and so they have to, in a sense, be reestablished. When we get to Leviticus, as we said, there's an incredible book about worship and the expression of worship, and all of that has come out of the end of Exodus, where not only has God revealed to Moses the terms of the covenant, he has also revealed to Moses a dwelling place, a tent, a tabernacle, a place where God would live and dwell and move along with his people. So, the story continues in the book of Numbers, and here again, there will be theological significance to the wilderness, to how God provides for the people, and again, the people are disobedient, so much so that God's punishment for them for destroying the terms of relationship, for breaking the covenant, will be that this people will die, this generation, original generation, will die in the wilderness, in the desert, and that the second generation will enter into a land of promise. So in this story, begin to look at the features that you see as you're kind of reading through or checking out some of the stories of Exodus, particularly following the storyline and seeing the worship of Leviticus, looking again at how, particularly in the book of Numbers, physical features play very significant and theological roles. And you'll begin again to see how these are further played out in the story of God as you continue to read the story throughout the rest of the Bible. So think in terms of Egypt and how it functions. Think in terms of a Red Sea. And think in terms of what a wilderness says and communicates. And yet there's a God there making a people of all things. Think in terms of the significance of a burning bush out in the wilderness and how God reveals himself through that. Think in terms of the significance of rivers. Think in terms of the Nile River, which was really the source for the life of Egypt. And think in terms of the Red Sea, and think in terms of the Jordan River, the river that will be crossed to get into the Promised Land. So they're just from the Nile to the Red Sea to the Jordan. The rivers begin to really come into play as helping us to understand the story of God and of his redemption. And so as you find yourself just becoming further acquainted with these books of Torah and catching some of these stories along the way, think in terms of not only their theological significance, think in terms of the geography upon which the story is told and how that plays into the story of redemption itself. And then as the story continues on through the rest of the Bible, you'll, from time to time, you'll come back to these places, to these rivers and wilderness places and mountains, and you'll be able to see how God's redemptive story unfolds yet again in places that are just like that. So I hope you enjoy your pilgrimage through your own wandering through these books, and when we're in class together, I know that we will enjoy just having a chance to have conversation about the theology of this book, the framework, and how the geography plays into the story of God's redemptive move through these books. I look forward to seeing you then. Have a good day.